You walk into the room, and within seconds, before a single word is spoken, the outcome has already been determined. Take a moment and let that sink in. The meeting you've spent hours preparing for, the job interview you've rehearsed for weeks, the social gathering where you hope to make crucial connections. In each case, the most consequential decisions are often made in the first moments through an invisible language that most people never learn to read, let alone speak. What if I told you there's an unacknowledged game being played around you at every moment? A game with real stakes, money, opportunity, influence, yet one where most participants don't even realize they're players. They stumble through, following instincts they don't understand, reacting to forces they can't name, wondering why the same people always seem to win while they remain stuck. This isn't about charisma or confidence. Those are merely surface manifestations of something far more fundamental. Beneath every human interaction lies a complex web of power dynamics that determine who speaks, who listens, who leads, and who follows. This invisible architecture of influence exists whether you're conscious of it or not. But here's what should disturb you. While you've remained unaware of these forces, others have been studying, mastering, and exploiting them to secure advantages you didn't even know were available. Think about the colleague who somehow always gets their proposals approved despite mediocre ideas, or how certain people command attention in any room without raising their voice, or why that person with less experience and fewer qualifications got the promotion you deserved. The uncomfortable truth: they're not just lucky, they're not necessarily more talented. They're operating with a different map of reality, one that reveals the pressure points and leverage opportunities in any social system. What would your life look like if you possessed this map? How would your career trajectory change if you could instantly decode the hidden power structures in your workplace? What relationships could you develop if you understood precisely how influence flows through social networks? Here's what you need to understand. Power dynamics aren't just about domination. They're about perception, position, and the subtle psychological triggers that determine how people value and respond to you. And contrary to what many believe, these dynamics can be systematically identified, analyzed, and reconfigured to your advantage. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal something that the most successful people throughout history have understood implicitly, a framework for not just participating in the game of social influence, but redesigning it entirely. But first, we need to explore the fundamental psychological principle that makes all of this possible. Robert Greene, author of The 48 Laws of Power, once observed that the need to make people dependent on you is a constant pressure that accompanies rising to a position of power. This insight wasn't original to Greene. It builds on a tradition stretching back centuries to one of history's most notorious and misunderstood political philosophers, Niccolo Machiavelli. In 1513, Machiavelli wrote The Prince after falling from political favor in Renaissance Florence. What most people don't realize is that Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty or unethical behavior as ends in themselves. He was doing something far more revolutionary. He was describing power as it actually operated, not as moralists pretended it should. Machiavelli wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are." This distinction between appearance and reality, between the visible and the hidden, forms the cornerstone of understanding power dynamics. But Machiavelli's insight was just the beginning. What he couldn't have anticipated was how modern psychological research would validate and expand his observations, revealing the cognitive mechanisms that make social hierarchies both inevitable and exploitable. Consider the groundbreaking work of social psychologist Robert Cialdini, who identified 6 principles of influence that operate beneath conscious awareness. reciprocity, commitment, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. These aren't just persuasion tactics. They're the invisible rails along which power runs in every human interaction. Or think about Amy Cuddy's research on how non-verbal displays of power literally change your hormonal composition within minutes. The body language of power doesn't just signal status. It biochemically transforms both how you feel and how others perceive you. But here's where it gets truly fascinating, and where most analyses fall short. These dynamics don't operate independently. They form interconnected systems, ecosystems of influence, that can be mapped, predicted, and reconfigured if you understand their underlying structure. The question becomes, how do these abstract principles translate into the conference rooms, social gatherings, and digital spaces where real-world power is negotiated today? This is where most people get stuck. They might recognize that power dynamics exist, perhaps even study individual tactics for projecting confidence or authority, but they fail to see the comprehensive system at work, the meta game, that determines which tactics will succeed in which contexts. Think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how certain environments seem to reward entirely different behaviors? How the quiet analyst might be overlooked in the sales department, but revered in engineering? How the charismatic storyteller dominates in one social circle, but comes across as insubstantial in another? These aren't random variations. They reflect different power ecosystems with different rules. And just as a biologist can identify the specific conditions that allow certain species to thrive in particular habitats, you can learn to recognize the specific signals that reveal which rules are operating in any social environment. But I need to warn you, what I'm about to share isn't just academic theory. It's going to challenge your basic assumptions about how social success is achieved. Some of these insights might make you uncomfortable because they expose the gap between how we're taught social systems should work and how they actually function. You'll begin to see that many of the rules you've been following were designed to keep you in a predetermined position within hierarchies that benefit others. You'll realize that much of what passes for meritocracy is actually an elaborate status game, where the metrics for success are defined by those already in power. And most importantly, you'll understand why those who master these dynamics don't need to announce their mastery. In fact, their power becomes most effective precisely when it remains undetected. But before I reveal the four-stage framework for mapping and exploiting social hierarchies, we need to address a critical question. How do you identify the specific type of power ecosystem you're dealing with in any given situation? Because the strategy that makes you ascendant in one environment could destroy your credibility in another. And this is exactly where most people make catastrophic social miscalculations. Let me introduce you to what I call the four ecosystems of power. Distinct social environments with unique rules, currencies, and success strategies. Understanding which ecosystem you're operating in is the critical first step that most people miss entirely. The first and most primitive power structure is the dominance ecosystem. This is the realm of explicit hierarchy, where authority is visible, formalized, and often enforced through clear consequences. Military organizations, traditional corporate structures, and hierarchical religious institutions operate primarily within this ecosystem. In dominance ecosystems, power is displayed openly. Status markers are explicit. Titles, corner offices, reserved parking spaces, speaking order in meetings. The currency of this ecosystem is compliance, your ability to enforce your will and ensure others follow your directives. But here's what most people miss. Even in these explicit hierarchies, the true power often doesn't reside with the most visibly dominant figures. Consider how an executive assistant with no formal authority might control access to a CEO, becoming the unseen gatekeeper whose favor can determine others' success. The key signals to identify a dominance ecosystem include frequent references to rank, title, or position, deference behaviors, like speaking only when acknowledged, physical arrangements that highlight status differences, decision-making that flows primarily from top to bottom. The exploitation strategy here isn't to challenge dominance directly. That's the amateur's mistake. Instead, you want to position yourself as the essential conduit through which dominant power flows. By making yourself indispensable to those with formal authority, you gain derivative power that often exceeds theirs in practical terms. This is how the consigliere often wields more real influence than the don, how the vizier sometimes controls more than the sultan. They appear subordinate while actually directing the application of power. The second power structure is the competence ecosystem, where authority derives from demonstrated skill, expertise, or specialized knowledge. Tech companies, research institutions, and creative industries tend to operate within this framework. In competence ecosystems, the visible markers of status are more subtle. Speaking time in meetings, how often your opinion is solicited, whether people wait for your approval before proceeding. The currency here is not compliance, but credibility, your perceived mastery of valuable knowledge or skills. The exploitation strategy in this ecosystem is counterintuitive. Rather than trying to demonstrate universal competence, which makes you appear defensive, you want to establish singular expertise in one high-leverage area while maintaining strategic incompetence in less valuable domains. By deliberately underwhelming in certain areas while over-delivering in crucial ones, you create a competence contrast that makes your true expertise appear even more exceptional. This is why the specialist, who seems slightly disorganized in general but delivers brilliant insights in their area, commands more respect than the generalist who performs adequately across domains. The third structure is the connection ecosystem, where power flows through relationships, networks, and social capital. This ecosystem dominates in politics, entertainment, and sales environments. Here, the markers of status include who initiates contact with whom, whose schedule accommodates others versus who expects accommodation, and most tellingly, who introduces whom to third parties. The currency in this system is access, your ability to connect people to opportunities, resources, or other valuable relationships. What few people realize is that connection power isn't about how many people you know. It's about exclusive access to different networks. The person who bridges otherwise separate groups, what network theorists call structural holes, controls information flow and opportunity distribution between those groups. The exploitation strategy here involves position more than personality. By deliberately placing yourself at the intersection of different value networks, being the only person who connects the engineering team with the marketing department, for instance, you create an information advantage that translates directly into influence. This is why the most connected people aren't necessarily extroverts with thousands of shallow relationships, but strategic networkers who serve as unique bridges between otherwise disconnected groups. The fourth and most sophisticated power structure is the perception ecosystem, where authority stems from narrative control and meaning-making. This ecosystem predominates in media, academia, and increasingly, in corporate cultures focused on mission and values. In perception ecosystems, status manifests through whose interpretation of events becomes the accepted reality, who defines what success looks like, and who determines which questions are worth asking. The currency here is legitimacy, your recognized right to shape the stories that give meaning to collective experience. The exploitation strategy in this ecosystem is subtle. Rather than asserting your own narrative directly, you position yourself as the curator of which perspectives deserve attention. By controlling the stage rather than performing on it, you shape reality without appearing to have an agenda. This is how thought leaders, editors, and curators often wield more influence than content creators themselves. They don't need to advocate specific positions when they control which positions get heard in the first place. Now, here's where it gets truly powerful. These ecosystems aren't separate realms. They overlap and interact in every social environment you enter. The person who can accurately identify which ecosystem predominates in a given context and adapt their strategy accordingly gains an almost unfair advantage. Consider a typical corporate meeting. You have formal authorities, dominance, subject matter experts, competence, well-connected team members, connection, and those who shape how the group understands its challenges, perception. Each is exercising a different form of power simultaneously. Most people operate exclusively within whichever ecosystem they're naturally strongest in. The technically brilliant remain trapped in the competence ecosystem, even when the situation calls for connection skills. The naturally charismatic rely on connection strategies, even when perception control would be more effective. But true power players are ecosystem fluid, able to diagnose which power structure dominates in a given context and shift their approach accordingly. Now, let's move beyond identification to action. Here's my 4-stage framework for exploiting these dynamics once you've recognized them. Map the ecosystem. Before attempting to change your position, conduct a thorough power audit. Who defers to whom? Whose opinions change group direction? Who speaks least but is most listened to when they do? These observations reveal the true hierarchy beyond formal titles. Identify value asymmetries. In every ecosystem, there are resources valued differently by different players. The key to rapid power accumulation is to identify resources you can acquire at low personal cost that others value highly. This creates opportunities for asymmetric returns on your social investments. Position before tactics. Beginners focus on what they say and do. Masters focus on where they stand. Strategic positioning, placing yourself at information bottlenecks or decision pathways, creates power without requiring constant effort to maintain it. Create dependency. Through selective excellence, rather than striving for well-rounded competence, develop disproportionate capability in one specific area that creates dependency from those above you in formal hierarchies. Your power grows when more senior people cannot succeed without your specific contribution. But a critical warning here. The most common mistake people make when attempting to apply these insights is approaching them as manipulative tactics rather than systematic strategies. Playing power games at the tactical level without understanding the broader system not only limits your effectiveness, it dramatically increases your risk of exposure. This brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of power dynamics. The most effective power often looks like its opposite. True influence frequently manifests as apparent deference. Strategic vulnerability creates strength. Selective incompetence enhances perceived competence in areas that matter more. Understanding these paradoxes separates the truly sophisticated player from the obvious operator whose machinations become their undoing. But to fully grasp how to implement these strategies without triggering resistance, we need to examine a psychological principle that explains why direct power moves typically backfire. Let me speak directly to you now, because I suspect you're experiencing one of two reactions at this point. Some of you are feeling a growing sense of recognition, perhaps even discomfort, as you reflect on situations where you've been outmaneuvered by someone who instinctively understood these dynamics while you were playing a different game entirely. You're mentally revisiting conversations, meetings, or relationships where the outcomes now make sense in ways they didn't before. Others might be feeling resistant, perhaps even morally opposed to viewing human interactions through this lens of strategic power analysis. You might be thinking, this is too calculating. Relationships should be authentic, not strategic. Both reactions are not only natural, they're revealing, and they bring us to the most crucial psychological principle underlying all power dynamics, the principle of perceived authenticity. Here's a truth that might challenge your self-perception. You are already engaged in power dynamics, whether you acknowledge them or not. Every time you decide when to speak in a meeting, how to phrase a request, or whom to build relationships with, you're making strategic social calculations. The only question is whether you're doing so consciously, with clear understanding of the actual rules, or unconsciously, following scripts you've never examined. This isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about removing the manipulation you're already subjected to by forces you haven't recognized. Think about your current position in your professional or social hierarchies. How much of that position was consciously designed by you, and how much was assigned to you by others' perceptions and expectations? How often have you felt that peculiar frustration of knowing you have more to offer than others seem willing to recognize? That gap between your self-perceived value and your socially recognized value represents the tax you pay for not understanding how power ecosystems operate. Let me make this concrete with a personal example. Early in my career, I was the hardest working person on my team. I had the most technical knowledge, put in the longest hours, and genuinely cared about our outcomes. Yet somehow, when opportunities for advancement appeared, they went to colleagues who objectively contributed less. It took me years to realize I wasn't being passed over despite my competence, but partially because of how I was displaying it. I was operating exclusively in the competence ecosystem, blindly accumulating expertise, while completely neglecting the connection and perception ecosystems where advancement decisions were actually made. My strategic error wasn't working hard on the wrong things. It was failing to recognize which power currencies were actually valuable in my specific context. Many of you are making this same mistake right now. You're investing enormous energy, accumulating the wrong kind of power for your environment. You're speaking the wrong language, playing the wrong game, measuring success by metrics that don't actually determine outcomes in your specific ecosystem. And here's what makes this particularly painful. The longer you operate with this misalignment, the more resentful you become. You interpret your lack of advancement as evidence that the system is rigged, rather than recognizing that you're simply using the wrong strategy for the system as it actually exists. This realization can be emotionally challenging. It means acknowledging that some of your past efforts, however sincere and diligent, were strategically misaligned. It means accepting that others who seemed less deserving of success understood something about social dynamics that you missed. But this recognition, uncomfortable as it might be, is also incredibly liberating, because once you understand how power actually flows through your specific environment, you can stop exhausting yourself, swimming against currents, and start positioning yourself where the natural flow carries you forward. Think about how different your approach might be if you clearly understood which power ecosystem dominates in your specific context. If you work in a dominance ecosystem but have been attempting to advance through demonstrated expertise alone, you've been playing the wrong game entirely. If you're in a connection ecosystem but have focused exclusively on building specialized skills rather than strategic relationships, you've been accumulating a currency that can't be spent effectively in your environment. If you operate in a perception ecosystem but have neglected to develop your narrative-shaping capabilities, you're essentially invisible, regardless of your other contributions. The question you need to ask yourself now is this: are you willing to see these dynamics as they actually exist, rather than how you wish they existed? Are you ready to bring the same strategic thinking to your social positioning that you bring to other aspects of your life? Because the truth is, the people who advance most effectively in any hierarchy are rarely those who work hardest within the existing rules. They're those who accurately perceive which rules actually matter and position themselves accordingly. This doesn't mean abandoning your values or authenticity. Quite the opposite. It means ensuring that your true value is accurately perceived rather than distorted by your strategic blind spots. But understanding these principles intellectually isn't enough. To truly transform how you navigate power dynamics, you need a systematic implementation process, a method for applying these insights to your specific situations without appearing calculating or manipulative. And this is precisely where most treatments of power dynamics fall short. They offer abstract principles without concrete implementation steps, or tactical tricks without strategic context. To bridge this gap, I've developed a practical framework I call strategic position analysis that allows you to systematically identify and exploit the unique power opportunities in your specific environments. Let me share with you the strategic position analysis framework, a practical method for applying everything we've discussed to your specific situations. This three-phase process will allow you to systematically identify and exploit the power dynamics in any environment. Begin by determining which power ecosystem dominates in your target environment. Look for these telltale signals. In dominance ecosystems, notice who speaks first, who interrupts without consequence, whose suggestions are implemented without debate. The key question: whose mere presence changes others' behavior? In competence ecosystems, observe whose expertise is sought on issues beyond their formal domain, who is exempted from standard requirements, whose judgment overrides established processes. The key question: whose assessment ends rather than extends debates? In connection ecosystems, identify who makes introductions versus receives them, who is included in unofficial gatherings, whose support is sought before formal proposals. The key question: who controls access to opportunities or relationships? In perception ecosystems, note who defines what constitutes success, whose framing of situations is adopted by the group, who determines which values take precedence. The key question: whose interpretation of events becomes the shared reality? Once you've identified the dominant ecosystem, you can strategically realign your approach to match the actual power currency of your environment rather than the stated values. After mapping the ecosystem, focus on optimizing your position within it, using these principles. First, the proximity principle. Power flows through proximity. Strategically, position yourself physically and organizationally near power sources. This doesn't mean constantly seeking face time with authority figures that signals lower status. Instead, arrange to be naturally present in the spaces where informal influence operates. Second, the indispensability principle. Develop unique capabilities that address critical vulnerabilities of those in power. The key is identifying capacities they lack yet need, creating dependency without threatening their position. Third, the selective excellence principle. Rather than attempting to excel universally, identify the specific domains where distinguished performance creates maximum leverage in your particular ecosystem. In dominance ecosystems, excel at solving problems that threaten those in authority. In competence ecosystems, develop distinctive expertise in emerging areas. In connection ecosystems, build bridges between valuable but disconnected networks. In perception ecosystems, become adept at translating complex realities into compelling narratives. The final phase involves elevating your position without triggering the defense mechanisms that typically respond to overt power moves. The attribution method. Arrange for your contributions to be recognized by third parties rather than self-promoted. Engineer situations where others naturally attribute success to your involvement without you claiming credit directly. The elevation through association strategy. Systematically associate yourself with high-status initiatives, ideas, and individuals through modest contributions that create natural linkage without seeming calculating. The strategic absence technique. Periodically create controlled scarcity of your presence or contribution, allowing others to recognize your value through its temporary unavailability. By implementing this framework consistently, you'll find yourself naturally ascending in influence without triggering the resistance that typically greets obvious power plays. Your advancement will appear to others as the natural consequence of your value rather than the result of deliberate positioning. This brings us full circle to Machiavelli's crucial insight that power operates most effectively when its mechanics remain unseen. The true masters of social dynamics aren't those who visibly struggle for position, but those who arrange circumstances so that desired outcomes appear to unfold naturally. What I've shared today isn't just theory. I've personally used this framework to navigate from being consistently overlooked in professional environments to becoming a sought-after advisor who shapes decisions far above my formal position. I've watched clients transform their effectiveness by simply realigning their strategies to match the actual power ecosystems they operate within, rather than the idealized versions they wished existed. The question now is whether you'll continue operating according to the visible rulebook that keeps most people confined to their assigned positions, or start engaging with the actual dynamics that determine outcomes in your environment. If you've truly understood the transformative potential of strategic power analysis, comment, "I see the matrix," below. This simple phrase will signal that you've moved beyond the surface-level understanding that limits most people's effectiveness and begun to perceive the actual systems that shape social reality. What I've shared today is just the beginning, the foundational framework for understanding the invisible dynamics that determine who advances and who stagnates in any social environment. But recognizing these principles is only the first step. The real transformation happens when you begin systematically applying them to your specific situations, identifying which power ecosystem dominates in your unique context, optimizing your position within it, and elevating your influence without triggering resistance. This isn't about manipulating others. It's about ensuring that your actual value is accurately perceived rather than distorted by strategic blind spots or systemic biases. It's about aligning your approach with reality as it exists rather than as you wish it existed. Think about where you are right now in your professional or social hierarchies. Now imagine where you could be 1 year from today if you were operating with perfect strategic clarity, if every interaction, every contribution, every relationship were optimized to create maximum leverage within your specific ecosystem. That gap represents the opportunity cost of continuing to navigate power dynamics unconsciously rather than strategically. In the coming weeks, I'll be sharing advanced applications of these principles, specialized frameworks for each ecosystem type, detailed case studies of strategic position transformation, and specific scripts for high-leverage situations like negotiations, interviews, and critical meetings. These aren't just abstract theories. They're practical tools that have helped thousands of people transform their effectiveness and advance to positions of influence they once thought were beyond their reach. If you're ready to stop playing by rules designed to keep you in your assigned place and start operating with true strategic clarity, subscribe right now. Click the subscribe button and enable notifications to ensure you don't miss the next installment in this series on mastering invisible power dynamics. The difference between those who achieve extraordinary influence and those who remain constrained by invisible limitations isn't intelligence, credentials, or even work ethic. It's strategic clarity, the ability to see and exploit the actual systems that determine outcomes, rather than the idealized versions we're encouraged to believe in. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive deeper into advanced positioning strategies for your specific ecosystem. Until then, start observing the environments you operate in through this new lens. You might be surprised by what suddenly becomes visible.